June 6, 1944, just before dawn. The English Channel was gray and unsettled, the kind of water that swallowed sound and distance. From the deck of a British command ship, senior officers stood in silence, binoculars raised, watching the horizon where the American sector lay hidden by smoke and mist. They had planned this invasion together, every timetable agreed, every assumption debated, every risk calculated. But no plan could soften what they were about to witness. As the haze lifted, the sea began to move. Landing craft surged forward in waves, too many to count. Columns broke apart under fire. Men disappeared into water stained dark almost immediately. Explosions ripped gaps through steel and flesh with equal indifference. The American beaches did not look like an advance. They looked like collapse. Some British officers expected hesitation. Some expected withdrawal. Some expected command to pause, reassess, and regroup. Instead, they watched something else entirely. Through smoke and chaos, American troops kept coming. Broken units reformed without orders. Men moved forward without cover. No trumpet call, no visible control, just relentless motion toward the shoreline. One British general lowered his binoculars slowly. What he was seeing was not doctrine. It was not elegance. It was not how Britain had learned amphibious war. But it was working. And in that moment, watching the American landings unfold, several British commanders realized something unsettling. The invasion would succeed, but not in the way anyone had expected. What British command expected, and why their expectations were cautious. By the time Allied commanders gathered to plan the invasion of Normandy, British generals carried the weight of experience that was both hard-earned and deeply sobering. Britain had been at war for nearly 5 years. Its senior officers had seen victories, failures, compromises, and reversals. They approached D-Day not with excitement, but with caution shaped by memory. Above all, they remembered Dieppe. In August 1942, British and Canadian forces had launched a large-scale raid against the French port of Dieppe. The operation was meant to test amphibious assault techniques and German coastal defenses. Instead, it became a lesson written in blood. Infantry were cut down on open beaches, tanks bogged down or burned, fire support failed to suppress defenders, command and control collapsed within minutes. For British leadership, Dieppe was not just a failure, it was a warning. It taught them that frontal beach assaults against fortified positions were brutally unforgiving, that momentum could vanish in minutes, that courage alone could not overcome interlocking fire, obstacles, and confusion. Many of the generals watching the American beaches in 1944 had been shaped directly by Dieppe's aftermath. Those lessons never left them. In the years that followed, British amphibious doctrine became methodical, deliberate, and heavily supported. Assaults were to be preceded by overwhelming naval fire gun, objectives were carefully limited, units advanced in tightly controlled phases, risk was managed wherever possible because Britain manpower was finite and irreplaceable. This mindset influenced how British commanders viewed their American allies. The United States had entered the war later, with vast resources and an army that expanded at extraordinary speed. American units trained intensively, but many lacked the long institutional memory of early war disasters. British generals respected American energy and industrial power, but they worried about inexperience under fire. This concern was not arrogance, it was professional anxiety. British officers had seen what happened when optimism met reality. They had learned to distrust boldness unsupported by preparation. They feared that American troops, despite training and enthusiasm, might falter when faced with the concentrated violence of a defended landing. These fears shaped planning discussions behind closed doors. British commanders worried about Omaha Beach in particular. Its terrain was unfavorable. High bluffs overlooked narrow exits. German defenses were stronger than initial intelligence suggested. Unlike some British and Canadian beaches, Omaha offered fewer sheltered approaches and fewer natural advantages. Contingent plans reflected this concern. Timetables included allowances for heavy casualties. Naval fire gun schedules were extended. Air bombardment was increased in hopes of suppressing defenders. There was quiet discussion, never public, about what might happen if an American beachhead failed to hold. This was the unspoken question haunting British headquarters. What if the Americans break? Not because they lacked courage, but because amphibious assaults magnified every weakness. Units landed scattered, leaders were lost early, communications failed, momentum could vanish faster than it could be restored. British generals had seen this before. In North Africa, they had learned that troops often needed time to harden under fire. In Sicily and Italy, they had seen landings succeed only after improvisation and painful adjustment. They didn't doubt American potential, but they doubted first contact. By June 1944, these doubts were carefully managed, not openly expressed. Officially, Allied unity was absolute.
Privately, British commanders watched the American sector with intense focus, not to judge, but to assess whether their fears would be confirmed. The British approach to D-Day reflected their experience. Their own landings, Gold and Sword beaches, were planned with heavy emphasis on coordination. Assault waves were tightly sequenced, armor was specialized, engineers were embedded early to clear obstacles. The goal was to minimize improvisation by overwhelming the problem methodically. American planning was different. The United States emphasized scale and redundancy, more men, more landing craft, more units landing simultaneously. The American approach accepted higher initial chaos in exchange for sustained pressure. It assumed that momentum, once established, could compensate for early losses. This difference was subtle on paper, but profound in execution. British generals understood that once the landings began, there would be no real control. Events would unfold faster than orders could be issued. Decisions would be made at platoon and company level, far from command ships and headquarters. That reality sharpened British concern. They trusted American leadership at the strategic level. They trusted American industry completely. What they questioned, quietly, was whether American troops, facing the most intense fire of their lives, would continue moving forward when everything around them said stop. D-Day was not simply an invasion, it was a test of assumptions forged by different wartime experiences. British generals had learned to fear failure early. American commanders believed in recovery through momentum. As dawn approached on June 6, 1944, British officers watched the sea not with hope, but with calculation. They were prepared for success, but they were also prepared to witness catastrophe. They expected heavy casualties, they expected confusion, they expected hesitation. What they did not expect was what unfolded instead, because as the first waves hit the American beaches, and as reports began filtering back, fragmented, incomplete, often contradictory, British commanders realized that something was happening that did not fit their experience. The Americans were not withdrawing, they were not regrouping offshore, they were not waiting for conditions to improve, they were pushing forward into chaos itself, and that realization marked the end of British assumptions shaped by earlier wars, and the beginning of a reassessment that would echo long after the smoke lifted from Normandy's shores. To British commanders, American preparations for D-Day often appeared deceptively simple. The scale was enormous, but the philosophy behind it seemed unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Where British planning emphasized control, limitation, and careful sequencing, American planning emphasized momentum, redundancy, and endurance. This difference did not come from carelessness, it came from experience of a different kind. The United States had mobilized later, but faster. Its army was built for expansion. Training systems were designed to absorb loss and replace it quickly. American doctrine accepted that initial contact with the enemy would be chaotic, but it assumed that chaos could be survived if enough force continued to flow forward. British generals understood the scale of American industry. What they underestimated was how deeply that scale shaped American thinking at every level. American assault units trained with the expectation that plans would break down immediately. Exercises emphasized decentralization. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were taught to act without waiting for orders. If leaders were lost, the unit did not stop. Someone else took over. This was not accidental. American planners knew that amphibious landings to wrench structures first. Radios failed. Officers were killed early. Units landed in the wrong places. The solution was not tighter control. It was cultural acceptance of disorder. British commanders, shaped by years of attritional warfare and limited manpower, had learned the opposite lesson. Disorder was dangerous. Control was survival. These two approaches collided on June 6, 1944. American soldiers were not trained to wait for perfection. They were trained to move forward regardless of conditions. This mindset was reinforced relentlessly in training camps across Britain. Assault rehearsals emphasized speed over alignment. If landing craft missed their sector, troops were taught to advance anyway. This philosophy extended to equipment and logistics. American units landed with overwhelming quantities of material. Ammunition was abundant. Engineers followed closely behind infantry. Casualty evacuation systems were prepared to function even under fire. Losses were expected and absorbed. British generals knew these preparations existed. What they struggled to grasp was how deeply they shaped behavior under fire. When the first American waves hit Omaha Beach, British observers saw dissonance. Units were scattered, landing craft were destroyed, men drowned under the weight of equipment. German fire dominated the beach. To British eyes, this looked like Dieppe all over again. At Dieppe, once momentum was lost, the operation collapsed. Units pinned down on open beaches could not advance. Fire support failed to suppress defenders. Withdrawal became the only option. British generals expected the same logic to apply, but American troops did not operate by that logic.
Small groups formed spontaneously. Soldiers crawled forward without orders. Junior leaders took initiative not because they were instructed to, but because they assumed no one else would. The absence of control did not paralyze them, it activated them. This was the crucial misunderstanding. British commanders equated chaos with failure. American commanders had built systems that assumed chaos and pushed through it. The difference was visible even in communication patterns. British reports emphasized coordination and confirmation. American reports emphasized progress, however limited. A unit that advanced 50 yards under fire reported success, not failure. This framing mattered. It sustained momentum psychologically as well as tactically. British commanders aboard command ships and headquarters ashore began receiving fragmented updates from the American beaches. Many reports were incomplete. Some contradicted others. Casualty numbers were high. Progress was uneven. Yet one pattern emerged clearly. The Americans were not pulling back. Despite losses that would have justified withdrawal under British doctrine, American units continued advancing inland wherever they could. They bypassed strongpoints, they climbed bluffs in small groups, they attacked from unexpected angles. British commanders watching this unfold felt a mix of concern and astonishment. They had expected American troops to break or pause under such conditions. Instead, they watched them adapt in real time, without orders, without coordination, but with relentless forward motion. This forced British generals to reassess their assumptions rapidly. American resilience did not come from elegance or precision. It came from depth of manpower, training, and logistics. Losses that would have crippled a British brigade were catastrophic but survivable for American divisions. This was not a moral judgment, it was a structural reality. British manpower constraints had taught their generals to avoid risk wherever possible. American abundance allowed risk to be embraced as a tool rather than feared as a liability. D-Day exposed this difference brutally. At Omaha Beach, the American assault came dangerously close to failure. British observers could see it. American commanders knew it. But the threshold for abandonment was far higher than British generals expected. Withdrawal was not considered until every alternative was exhausted. This mindset stunned British leadership. They realized that American doctrine accepted a level of attrition that Britain could no longer afford. It was not recklessness, it was strategic calculation grounded in industrial reality. As the morning progressed and American forces began breaking through at multiple points, British generals recognized that what they were witnessing was not disorder resolving into order, but disorder being weaponized. Chaos was not an obstacle to overcome, it was the environment Americans had trained to fight within. This realization reshaped Allied perceptions. British commanders gained new respect for American troops, not for their finesse but for their endurance. They understood that American forces would not retreat easily, even when logic suggested they should. This made them unpredictable to the enemy and difficult to stop. German defenders felt the shift immediately. On the American beaches, German units reported confusion. The expected collapse did not occur. Instead of a single decisive push, they faced constant pressure from small, aggressive groups attacking from multiple directions. Firepower was diluted. Defenders were outflanked piecemeal. British generals watching reports accumulated recognized the strategic implication. If the Americans held, the invasion would succeed, even if at terrible cost. By late morning, as reports confirmed that American forces were consolidating inland, British commanders reached a quiet conclusion. Their earlier fears had been misplaced, not because the Americans avoided disaster, but because they absorbed it and moved through it. This was not how Britain would have done it. But it worked. And in that realization, British generals began to understand that the Allied war effort had entered a new phase, one in which American operational philosophy would increasingly define how battles were fought and won. That understanding set the stage for deeper analysis, not just of what happened on the beaches, but of what it meant for leadership, tactics, and the future of coalition warfare. Human angle, what British commanders felt while watching it unfold. For British generals, D-Day was not experienced from the sand or the surf. It was experienced through distance, binoculars, radios, maps, and fragmented reports arriving faster than they could be interpreted. This distance did not soften the emotional impact. In some ways, it intensified it. They watched, knowing they could not intervene directly. British officers aboard command ships and in forward headquarters understand amphibious warfare intimately. They knew how quickly momentum could be lost, how fast fear could spread, how easily units pinned on open ground could become casualties rather than combatants. Watching the American sector, they recognized every warning sign they had learned to fear. The landing craft were late. Naval gunfire had missed key targets. Air bombardment failed to suppress defenses. Units were landing in the wrong places. Each of these failures in isolation was survivable. Together, they formed the exact pattern British commanders associated with disaster. Yet what unsettled them most was not the chaos, it was the American response to it. British doctrine emphasized stabilization. When conditions deteriorated, the instinct was to halt, regroup, restore control, and then proceed. That instinct came from experience. It saved lives. It preserved units. The Americans did something else. Reports indicated that small groups were advancing without waiting for alignment. Platoons were attacking strongpoints independently. Leadership losses were being absorbed rather than halting movement. For British generals, this looked like loss of control. But the Americans did not interpret it that way. As casualty figures rose, British officers felt a familiar tightening in the chest, the sense that events were slipping beyond acceptable risk. They had felt it before at the end. They expected it to end the same way. Instead, they watched American units continue forward under conditions that would have triggered withdrawal discussions in British command circles. This produced a complex emotional response. There was admiration, but also anxiety. Respect, but also fear that such losses could not be sustained. British generals were not questioning American courage. They were questioning whether courage alone could substitute for control. By mid-morning, as reports confirmed that American troops were reaching the bluffs and pushing inland, something shifted among British observers. They realized that what they were watching was not recklessness. It was endurance. Tactical angle. Why the American assault defied British amphibious logic. British amphibious doctrine was built on sequencing and suppression. Firepower was meant to neutralize defenses before infantry exposed themselves. Armor was meant to arrive early to provide cover. Engineers were meant to clear paths before momentum stalled. At Omaha, nearly all of these assumptions failed. German defenses remained active. Armor was delayed or destroyed. Beach obstacles slowed movement. Exits were blocked. Under British doctrine, this would have constituted a halt condition. American doctrine did not define it that way. American planners accepted that suppression might be incomplete. They expected some defenses to survive. Their solution was not perfection but saturation, enough men arriving continuously that some would find gaps.
British generals watching this unfold felt tactical inefficiency bordering on waste. Men were advancing without coordinated fire. Units were attacking without clear flanks. Casualties were severe. Yet the tactical effect was undeniable. German defenders faced pressure everywhere, not just at planned breakthrough points. Strong points that should have dominated the beach were bypassed, isolated, or attacked from unexpected angles. The Americans did not wait to reduce every position before moving inland. This approach violated British instincts. British generals preferred clean breakery supported by overwhelming firepower. They viewed incomplete suppression as an invitation to catastrophe. The American method embraced exposure in exchange for speed and unpredictability. On the German side, this created confusion. German defensive plans assumed that heavy fire would stop the assault cold. They expected attackers to regroup offshore or concentrate at obvious exit points. Instead, they faced constant infiltration by small groups moving through smoke, terrain, and chaos. British generals recognized this effect as reports accumulated. The Americans were not winning by force alone. They were winning by refusing to conform. The tactical lesson was unsettling because it challenged assumptions British officers have relied on for years. It suggested that under certain conditions, accepting chaos could be more effective than controlling it. Technological angle. When equipment failed and people compensated. D-Day was supposed to be a showcase of Allied technology. Specialized armor, landing craft refined through years of development, naval and air firepower synchronized to minute-by-minute schedules. At Omaha, much of that technology underperformed. Sea conditions scattered landing craft, amphibious tanks hacked, bombing runs overshot targets, communications broke down almost immediately. British generals watching the American sector saw technology failing at the worst possible moment. Their experience told them that when technology failed, operations followed. But what they saw instead was human compensation. American soldiers adjusted loads on the beach. They abandoned heavy equipment to move faster. Engineers improvised under fire. Infantry used terrain creatively, shell holes, wreckage, or smoke, to advance in ways no plan had predicted. This improvisation was not random. It reflected training and emphasized initiative over adherence. American soldiers were taught that plans were starting points, not guarantees. When equipment failed, movement continued. British doctrine placed greater faith in technology as a stabilizing force. When it failed, British units were more likely to pause until it could be restored. This difference shaped how each army reacted under stress. British generals understood this distinction intellectually. Watching it in real time made it visceral. They realized that American reliance on people rather than systems allowed momentum to survive technological breakdown. Losses were higher, but progress continued. This realization forced British commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their own caution, born of necessity, might limit flexibility in environments where disorder could not be avoided. By late morning, the combined weight of human endurance, tactical unpredictability, and technological improvisation had produced a result British generals had not expected. The American beaches were holding. Not cleanly, not efficiently, but decisively. That understanding altered how British leadership interpreted the rest of the invasion. It prepared them to reassess not just American performance on D-Day, but the broader direction of Allied warfare moving forward. And it set the stage for deeper reflection on leadership, enemy reaction, and the moral cost of success at such scale. Leadership angle. When British command quietly changed their mind. As the morning in June 6 unfolded, British generals began doing something that rarely happened in the middle of an operation. They reassessed long-held assumptions in real time. This was not done publicly. It was not written down in orders. It happened in silence, between reports. For years, British senior leadership had viewed American forces as powerful but untested at the very edge of war. They respected American industry and planning capacity, but privately questioned how American troops would react when plans collapsed and casualties mounted beyond expectation. Omaha Beach answered that question brutally. British generals listening to American situation reports noticed a pattern that contradicted their fears. Communications were fragmented, but they carried a consistent message. Units were still moving forward. Not in formation, not according to schedule, but forward. This forced British leadership to confront a difficult truth. American command philosophy did not depend on preserving cohesion in the same way British doctrine did. Where British commanders sought to reassemble units before continuing, American commanders accepted fragmentation as long as momentum survived. This was not inferior leadership. It was a different kind of leadership. British generals realized that American officers at every level were comfortable delegating authority downward, even when communication was lost. They trusted junior leaders to act without guidance, knowing that some actions would fail but enough would succeed to sustain pressure. This trust was not theoretical, it was operational. As reports confirmed that American troops were establishing footholds above the bluffs, British commanders recognized that the invasion's success no longer hinged on whether Omaha had gone according to plan. It hinged on whether American forces would refuse to quit despite catastrophic losses. They were refusing. This realization reshaped British confidence in the coalition, not because the Americans fought better, but because they fought differently, and in ways that complemented British strengths. British caution had ensured the invasion was planned meticulously. American endurance ensured it survived first contact. From that point onward, British generals understood that the Allied war effort would increasingly rely on American tolerance for chaos and loss, balanced by British experience in control and consolidation. This was not admiration alone, it was recalibration.
German defenders on the American beaches expected something very different from what occurred. German coastal doctrine assumed that amphibious assaults were fragile at their most exposed moment. Heavy casualties, broken formations, and disrupted landings were expected to cause attackers to stall, regroup, or withdraw. This assumption was not irrational, it was based on historical precedent. At Omaha, German units believed they had achieved exactly that. Early reports from German strongpoints described devastating fire, landing craft destroyed, infantry pinned on open beaches, armor eliminated before reaching shore. From the German perspective, the assault appeared to be collapsing. What followed confused them. Despite inflicting enormous casualties, German defenders did not see the expected pause. Instead of massing at predictable exit points, American troops began appearing in unexpected places. Small groups climbed terrain thought impassable. Attacks came from flanks that should not have existed. German officers reported increasing difficulty maintaining coherent fire plans. Strongpoints designed to dominate wide sectors found themselves isolated as Americans bypassed rather than assaulted them directly. German reserves, limited and poorly positioned, struggled to respond to multiple simultaneous threats. The Americans did not attack like a single force. They attacked like many. This shattered German assumptions. German doctrine emphasized centralized fire control and prepared fields of fire. It assumed attackers would concentrate and therefore be targetable. The American approach diluted German advantages by refusing to conform to those expectations. British generals, reading intercepted reports in battlefield intelligence later in the day, understood the significance immediately. The Germans had planned to break the invasion by breaking cohesion. The Americans removed cohesion as a requirement for success. This was not brilliance in the traditional sense. It was resilience weaponized. German commanders would later note that the American assault was not tactically elegant, but strategically overwhelming. They could not stop pressure that came from everywhere at once. British generals recognized this as a decisive insight, not just for D-Day, but for the remainder of the campaign in Western Europe. Moral angle: the cost of success observed, not felt. For British commanders, one of the most difficult aspects of D-Day was the moral distance between decision and consequence. They had authorized the invasion, they had shaped the plan, but they were not on the beaches. Watching the American sector, British generals understood that success was being purchased at a terrible human cost. Casualty figures rose steadily throughout the morning. Reports confirmed losses that would have been unacceptable in earlier British operations. And yet, those losses were producing results. This created a moral tension that British leadership could not ignore. British doctrine had evolved specifically to avoid such attrition. Britain's smaller population and earlier losses had forced its commanders to prioritize conservation of manpower. British generals were trained to think in terms of sustainability over time. The American assault challenged that logic. The United States could absorb losses that Britain could not. This was not a matter of callousness, it was arithmetic. British generals watching Omaha understood that American endurance, backed by American industry and population, altered the moral calculus of warfare. This realization was uncomfortable. It meant that future operations might succeed through methods Britain itself could not afford to use. It meant that coalition warfare would increasingly rely on American willingness to accept losses that British leadership would struggle to justify domestically. Yet there was no denying the outcome. The invasion was holding. The beachhead was expanding. German resistance was being broken. British generals did not celebrate this fact. They absorbed it. They understood that the war would now move inland, where British experience in set-piece battles and consolidation would matter more. But they also understood that without the American willingness to endure the initial storm, none of that would be possible. This recognition carried weight beyond D-Day. It reshaped British attitudes towards American leadership for the remainder of the war. It influenced how responsibilities were divided. It reinforced the reality that victory would depend on combining different national strengths, not forcing uniformity. British caution had prevented reckless planning. American resilience had prevented collapse. Together, they had achieved something neither could have accomplished alone. By the end of June 6th, British generals were no longer asking whether the Americans would hold. They were asking how far they would push. And that question, answered over the following weeks in Normandy's hedgerows, would define the next phase of the war in Western Europe. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the American assault at Omaha Beach hovered on the edge of disaster. British generals watching from command ships and headquarters did not need dramatic language to describe what they saw. The evidence was already there, etched into casualty reports, stalled units, and radio messages that grew more fragmented with every passing minute. The landing had gone wrong in ways planners feared most. Strong currents pushed landing craft east of their intended sectors. Many assault units came ashore far from their designated exits. Amphibious tanks, meant to provide immediate fire support, had sunk in rough seas. Naval bombardment, delayed and imprecise, failed to neutralize key German positions on the bluffs. The beach itself became a killing ground. Men lay pinned behind obstacles and shingle, exposed to interlocking fire from above. Officers fell early. Radios were destroyed or waterlogged. Command relationships collapsed almost instantly. From a British doctrinal perspective, this was the moment operations were meant to pause. At Dieppe, this moment had ended the raid. British generals watching Omaha recognized the pattern with chilling clarity. They had seen this exact sequence before: shock, fragmentation, paralysis. In British experience, these conditions demanded withdrawal, or at least offshore regrouping before losses became irreversible. Yet no such withdrawal came. American commanders at sea faced the same information and reached a different conclusion. Reports from the beach were grim, but they carried a crucial detail. Small units were still advancing. Not in mass, not according to plan, but forward. Here, a platoon had reached the base of the bluffs. There, engineers were cutting paths through wire under fire. Elsewhere, infantry were scaling terrain thought impassable. British generals noted something subtle but decisive.
There was no single American breakthrough to point to. Instead, there were dozens of tiny penetrations, uncoordinated, costly, and persistent. The assault did not hinge on one decisive action. It depended on accumulation. This defied British expectations. British doctrine sought clarity before commitment. It emphasized restoring structure before pressing on. The American approach accepted that structure might never fully return, and proceeded anyway. As the morning wore on, British observers realized the Americans had crossed a psychological threshold. They were no longer attempting to land. They were already fighting inland. The shift mattered. Once American troops reached the base of the bluffs, the geometry of the battle changed. German strongpoints designed to dominate the beach were suddenly exposed. Their heavy weapons were fixed in place. Their ammunition was finite. British generals understood the implication immediately. The moment American soldiers reached the high ground, even in small numbers, the invasion's failure became far less likely. German defenses were formidable, but they were static. They relied on controlling approach routes. Once bypassed, their power diminished rapidly. Still, the cost was staggering. Casualty figures continued to climb. Units were operating without clear leadership. Medical evacuation struggled to keep pace with the wounded. British officers watching this unfold experienced a familiar conflict between logic and outcome. By British standards, the assault should have been halted to prevent further loss. By American standards, halting would have ensured defeat. This difference lay at the heart of the turning point. American commanders understood that momentum was the only currency that mattered. If it was lost, German defenses would restore control. If it was maintained, no matter how chaotically, German resistance would eventually fracture. British generals watched American leaders make decisions that would have been unthinkable in earlier British operations. They committed reserves into uncertainty. They accepted loss of coordination as unavoidable. They refused to authorize withdrawal, even when success was not guaranteed. This was not blind courage. It was calculation. American planners had built the invasion around redundancy. Losses were anticipated. Units were designed to function without centralized control. Junior leaders were expected to make decisions independently. On Omaha, those assumptions were tested to the limit, and held. By late morning, British headquarters began receiving reports that confirmed what binoculars and radio fragments had hinted at earlier. American forces were establishing continuous footholds inland. Engineers were opening beach exits. Artillery was being brought ashore. German counterattacks were disorganized and ineffective. The crisis had passed. British generals understood the significance immediately. The invasion had survived its most vulnerable phase, not through flawless execution, but through refusal to collapse. The Americans had absorbed punishment on a scale British commanders had feared, yet they had continued moving forward. This realization forced a profound reassessment. British leadership recognized that American operational philosophy had succeeded where British caution might have failed, not because it was more human or efficient, but because it was designed for a different kind of war, one fought by mass, endurance, and replacement. The turning point was not marked by a single order or announcement. It emerged quietly, as reports shifted from pinned to advancing, from isolated to holding, from critical to improving. British generals felt a mixture of relief and unease. Relief because the invasion would succeed. Unease because the method challenged everything they believed about how such success should be achieved. They understood that the Americans had not avoided catastrophe. They had moved through it. This distinction mattered. The success at Omaha was not clean. It was not elegant. It would never be remembered as a textbook assault. But it achieved what mattered most, a secure foothold on the continent. From that moment forward, British generals no longer questioned whether the Americans could fight under the worst possible conditions. They knew the answer. What remained was to understand what this meant for the future of the campaign, and how the combination of British caution and American endurance would shape the war in Western Europe from that day onward.
Their communication lines were fragile. As American soldiers attacked from angles never anticipated in German plans, the defenders lost the advantage of preparation. British generals understood this transition immediately. They had planned countless operations where the critical moment came not at first contact, but at consolidation. The difference at Omaha was that consolidation did not wait for order. It emerged organically from persistence. American commanders on the ground did not attempt to reassemble perfect formations. They linked what they could. They pushed artillery forward as soon as paths were cleared. They committed reinforcements directly into partial success rather than waiting for certainty. This approach would have alarmed British leadership earlier in the war. On D-Day, it impressed them, because it worked. As afternoon reports reached British headquarters, a pattern became undeniable. German resistance was weakening unevenly, then rapidly. Isolated strongpoints surrendered or were bypassed entirely. Counterattacks lacked coordination and strength. The defenders no longer controlled the tempo of the fight. British generals watching this progression felt a sense of inevitability settle in. The invasion would not be reversed. The Americans had crossed a point beyond which German defenses could not recover, not because they had achieved overwhelming superiority, but because they had denied the Germans the chance to stabilize. This realization reshaped British thinking about coalition warfare. They understood now that American forces excelled in turning partial success into momentum. They did not require perfect conditions to advance. They exploited uncertainty ruthlessly, not only in the enemy, but within their own ranks. This philosophy unsettled traditional British sensibilities, but its effectiveness could not be denied. By late afternoon, British generals observed that American beach exits were functioning, vehicles were moving inland, supply lines, those strained, were operating, command relationships were slowly re-emerging. The beachhead had transformed from a precarious foothold into a functioning front. This was the moment shock gave way to certainty. British leadership recognized that the invasion had achieved its primary objective. The question was no longer whether the Americans would hold, but how quickly they would push forward. This realization carried strategic weight. It meant that British and Canadian forces advancing from their own beaches would soon link with American units inland. It meant that the campaign in Normandy would unfold as planned, though not without continued heavy fighting. It also meant that Allied confidence in American ground forces had changed permanently. British generals would later reflect that D-Day altered perceptions at every level of command, not because American troops had performed flawlessly, but because they had endured conditions that would have broken less resilient forces. They had absorbed chaos and turned it into advantage. As night approached, British commanders reviewed casualty estimates and situation maps with sober understanding. The cost had been immense. The success was undeniable. The American beaches were secure. And in that security lay a truth British generals could no longer ignore. The nature of modern warfare had shifted. Scale, endurance, and decentralization were now decisive factors alongside planning and experience. D-Day had proven that victory no longer belonged solely to those who controlled battle best, but to those who could survive its worst moments without breaking. That understanding would shape Allied operations for the remainder of the war. When the fighting on June 6th finally subsided into something resembling order, British generals did not celebrate. They reviewed. They recalculated. They tried to understand what D-Day had revealed, not just about the enemy, but about their own assumptions. The immediate aftermath was dominated by numbers. Casualty estimates from the American beaches were sobering. Losses were far higher than on British and Canadian sectors. Omaha, in particular, stood out as a place where success had come dangerously close to failure. British commanders understood that if they judged the operation purely by cost, it would raise uncomfortable questions. But war is not judged by cost alone. British headquarters began receiving clearer reports as communications stabilized. Units were identified, positions were confirmed. Maps that had been filled with question marks slowly acquired solid lines. American forces were not only holding, they were preparing to move inland. This forced British generals to reassess their earlier expectations. Before D-Day, British leadership had quietly believed that if any Allied sector faltered, it would most likely be American, not because of weakness, but because of inexperience at this scale of amphibious assault. That assumption no longer held. What British generals saw instead was an army that had survived first contact with reality at the worst possible moment and adapted faster than anticipated. This realization did not lead to triumphalism, it led to professional respect. British commanders understood that the Americans had achieved success through methods Britain itself could not afford to use. The United Kingdom, after years of war, no longer possessed the manpower reserves to absorb such losses repeatedly. British doctrine had evolved out of necessity, not preference. The Americans operated under different constraints. British generals now saw clearly how American industrial and demographic strength translated directly into operational behavior. Where Britain sought to minimize exposure, America accepted it. Where Britain emphasized control, America emphasized continuity of pressure. Neither approach was inherently superior, but together they explained why the invasion had held. In the days immediately following D-Day, British leadership began adjusting expectations for the campaign ahead. They anticipated that American forces would press forward aggressively, even when terrain and resistance suggested caution. British forces would follow, consolidate, and exploit. This division of labor was not written into doctrine, but it emerged organically. British commanders also noted a psychological shift within Allied leadership. The shock of D-Day had stripped away lingering doubts about American resolve. No British general who watched Omaha unfold would ever again question whether American troops would endure under extreme conditions. That question was settled permanently. At the same time, British officers were keenly aware of the moral burden carried by the outcome. Success had been purchased at a cost that would weigh heavily on commanders responsible for ordering future operations. This awareness tempered any sense of vindication. British generals had spent years trying to reduce unnecessary loss. Watching the Americans succeed through relentless exposure forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that some victories could only be achieved by accepting what Britain had spent years trying to avoid. This did not make them eager to adopt American methods wholesale. It made them cautious about when and where such methods were appropriate. In this way, D-Day refined British thinking rather than overturning it. They did not abandon control. They did not abandon caution. But they no longer mistook caution for superiority. As intelligence reports accumulated in the following days, British headquarters analyzed German reactions. Enemy units in Normandy had been stunned by the persistence of the American assault. German commanders reported confusion, loss of initiative, and inability to mount coordinated counterattacks. British generals recognized that this psychological effect was as important as any tactical gain.
The Germans had expected the invasion to break at its most violent moment. Instead, it had intensified. This shattered confidence not just on the beaches, but throughout the German command structure in the West. British leadership understood what this meant. The invasion had not merely succeeded, it had destabilized the enemy at a strategic level. This understanding reinforced British confidence in the overall Allied approach. The invasion had proven that coalition warfare, when properly aligned, could overcome even the strongest defenses. Britain had provided experience, planning, and restraint. America had provided mass, momentum, and endurance. Neither alone would have been enough. In the aftermath of D-Day, British generals began preparing for the next phase of the campaign with renewed clarity. They expected brutal fighting inland. They anticipated slow progress through hedgerows and fortified villages. They knew the Germans would recover enough to resist fiercely, but they no longer feared collapse. The Americans had demonstrated that even under the worst imaginable conditions, they would not quit. That knowledge allowed British commanders to plan boldly, knowing that their partners would not falter when pressure mounted. This shift in confidence shaped every major Allied decision in the weeks that followed. From the push toward Caen to the breakout from Normandy, British generals operated with the understanding that American forces could absorb the shock of rapid advances and counterattacks. British units could then consolidate and stabilize gains. This complementary relationship became the foundation of Allied success in Western Europe. D-Day was the proving ground. For British generals, the aftermath was not about vindication or surprise. It was about adjustment, of expectations, of trust, and of responsibility. They had watched American troops endorse something Britain feared repeating. They had seen success emerge not from precision, but from refusal to yield. That lesson stayed with them. And as the campaign moved inland, British commanders carried that understanding forward, shaping how they coordinate, supported, and relied upon American forces in the battles yet to come. As the Allied foothold in Normandy solidified over the days following June 6th, British generals found themselves confronting a quiet of irreversible shift. The invasion had not only opened a second front in Western Europe, it had altered how Britain understood its own place within the alliance. This realization did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated. Each situation report from the American sector reinforced the same conclusion. Despite immense losses, American units were maintaining pressure, reorganizing under fire, and expanding their operational reach inland. This behavior was no longer extraordinary, it was becoming predictable. British commanders began to plan around that predictability. Where earlier British operations had been structured to avoid prolonged exposure, new planning assumptions emerged. British leadership now expected American forces to take on the most attritional phases of advance, absorbing counterattacks and sustaining momentum, while British units focused on consolidation, coordination, and exploitation. This was not exploitation in the moral sense, it was strategic realism. Britain had fought since 1939, its officer corps had matured under scarcity, its manpower pool had narrowed. British generals understood that their strength now lay in experience, not endurance. D-Day made this unmistakably clear. The Americans, by contrast, were only at the beginning of their continental campaign. British leadership understood that American endurance on D-Day was not an isolated event, it was a preview. The same tolerance for loss and disorder would soon be applied inland, where battles would stretch for weeks rather than hours. This understanding reshaped how British commanders communicated with their American counterparts. There was less hesitation, less second-guessing, less concern that American units would disengage prematurely. Trust had replaced caution. British officers no longer framed discussions about whether American forces could hold under pressure. They assumed they would, and focused instead on how best to support and synchronize. This shift extended beyond Normandy. In planning sessions that followed, British generals began treating American operational tempo as a given. Timelines were built around American advances. British forces were assigned roles that complemented rather than mirrored American action. This marked a quiet end to earlier doubts. Before D-Day, British leadership had often viewed the alliance through the lens of mentorship, experienced partner guiding an eager but untested ally. After D-Day, that perception no longer held. The Americans had passed their initiation at the costliest possible moment. British generals did not envy that cost, but they respected what it proved. At the same time, British leadership remained deeply aware of the moral implications. They understood that American success on D-Day was inseparable from casualty figures that would haunt units for years. The ability to endure loss did not erase its human weight. British commanders carried this awareness into subsequent operations.
They became more deliberate about how and when British units were committed. They sought to limit exposure where possible, knowing that American forces were bearing a disproportionate share of the most violent engagements. This was not detachment, it was responsibility. British generals understood that coalition warfare required honest acknowledgement of limits. D-Day clarified those limits with brutal precision. As the campaign progressed into the hedgerows of Normandy, the lessons of June 6th continued to influence decisions. British commanders anticipated that American advances would create opportunities, but also crises. German counterattacks would focus on sectors where American momentum threatened to break through. British forces positioned themselves accordingly. This interplay became the defining rhythm of the campaign. American pressure forced German reaction. British consolidation prevented German recovery. Neither role was secondary. British leadership understood that their earlier fears of American inexperience leading to collapse had been misplaced. The Americans had not avoided collapse because they were flawless. They had avoided it because they were relentless. That distinction mattered deeply. Relentlessness could be planned around. Flawlessness could not be assumed. This realization stabilized Allied command relationships for the remainder of the war. British generals no longer felt compelled to hedge against American failure. They focused instead on maximizing combined strength. Planning became more confident, coordination more direct. D-Day had removed uncertainty at the highest level. For British commanders, the invasion marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Britain had carried the war alone, then with limited allies for years. Now it fought alongside a partner capable of sustaining the war's heaviest blows. That shift carried emotional weight. British generals were proud of their army's endurance and discipline. They did not relinquish leadership lightly, but they recognized that the war's center of gravity had moved. D-Day confirmed it. American forces were now the engine of Allied momentum in Western Europe. British forces will remain essential, but in a complementary role shaped by experience rather than mass. This understanding did not diminish Britain's contribution, it clarified it. As reports continued to arrive from Normandy in the weeks following the invasion, British headquarters operated with a new confidence. Setbacks were anticipated, but not feared. The Americans would push, the British would hold and shape. Together, they would advance. For British generals, the aftermath of D-Day was not about surprise anymore. It was about adaptation. The invasion had answered every lingering question about American resolve. What remained was the long, grinding work of liberation. And that work would be guided by a lesson learned in blood on the beaches of Normandy, one that British commanders would never forget. When the guns finally fell silent along the Normandy coast, the meaning of June 6, 1944 did not arrive all at once. For British generals, it emerged slowly, over days, then weeks, then years. D-Day was not simply a successful invasion, it was a moment that exposed the deepest truths of modern war, alliance, and human endurance. What they had witnessed from command ships and headquarters was not a textbook operation, it was something far more unsettling. British commanders had expected violence, they had expected chaos, they had even expected the possibility of failure. What they had not fully anticipated was the way American troops responded when every assumption collapsed simultaneously. They saw soldiers advance without structure. They saw units fight without cohesion. They saw momentum survive where logic suggested it should die. This forced British generals to confront a reality they had been approaching for years but had never seen so clearly. Modern war had outgrown traditional control. The scale of violence, the speed of events, and the fragility of systems meant that no plan could truly govern first contact anymore. What mattered was not perfection. What mattered was refusal to break. British military culture had been shaped by restraint, by limits, by the understanding that manpower was precious and irreplaceable. That culture had saved Britain more than once. But on D-Day, British generals realized that restraint alone could not open a continent. America could do something Britain no longer could. It could absorb the shock. This realization was not comforting. It was sobering. British generals were not naive men dazzled by spectacle. They understood exactly what American success cost. They read casualty lists. They spoke with wounded officers. They knew that the beaches of Normandy would echo in American units for decades. What unsettled them was not that the Americans paid such a price, but that the price worked. The invasion succeeded not because losses were avoided, but because they were endured without collapse. That truth challenged moral assumptions as much as tactical ones. British commanders had spent years refining methods to reduce exposure, conserve lives, and fight efficiently. D-Day suggested that there were moments when efficiency was irrelevant, when only momentum mattered. This did not make British generals eager to adopt American methods wholesale. It made them more honest about the kind of war they were fighting. They understood that victory in Western Europe would not come from brilliance alone. It would come from sustained pressure applied relentlessly over time. Pressure that required mass, replacement, and endurance, on a scale only the United States could provide. D-Day crystallized this understanding. From that point forward, British leadership no longer saw American forces as promising allies still proving themselves. They saw them as the decisive weight of the alliance. That shift altered everything. It reshaped command relationships. It changed planning assumptions. It redefined trust. British generals no longer asked whether Americans could hold under pressure. They asked how best to synchronize with an ally who would continue advancing regardless of cost. This trust was not blind. It was earned. It was earned on beaches where retreat would have been reasonable. It was earned under fire that would have justified withdrawal. It was earned in moments when survival required more than doctrine. For British commanders, D-Day was therefore not just a military success. It was a revelation about the nature of coalition warfare. Britain brought experience, discipline, and caution. America brought mass, momentum, and resilience. Neither quality alone would have been enough. Together, they created something capable of breaking a fortress continent.
This understanding carried British leadership through the rest of the war. In Normandy's hedgerows, in the breakout at St. Lo, in the drive across France and into Germany, British generals planned with the knowledge that American forces would absorb the heaviest blows and keep moving. That knowledge allowed Britain to fight intelligently rather than desperately. Yet the memory of D-Day never softened. British generals never forgot the sight of American landing craft disintegrating under fire. They never forgot the reports of units shattered before reaching the sand. They never forgot how close the invasion came to unraveling entirely. The success did not erase the cost, it coexisted with it. This dual awareness shaped how British commanders remembered the war. They did not romanticize D-Day. They did not simplify it. They spoke of it with respect, gravity, and restraint. Because they understood what had truly happened. They had witnessed a modern army pass through the crucible of chaos and emerged intact, not because it avoided failure, but because it endured it. That endurance changed the trajectory of the war. It convinced British leadership that the liberation of Europe was no longer a question of if, but how long. It confirmed that the Allies possessed not just the means, but the will, to sustain the kind of fighting the task demanded. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed something enduring about warfare itself. That no matter how advanced planning becomes, no matter how refined doctrine grows, war will always reduce itself, at critical moments, to human beings deciding whether to keep moving forward when everything argues against it. On D-Day, British generals watched Americans make that decision, again and again, under the worst conditions imaginable. That is why they were stunned. Not by power, not by numbers, but by the simple, relentless refusal to stop. That refusal opened the road to liberation, and it remains one of the defining truths of the Second World War.